The vibration of the cello string didn't just fill the acoustic expanse of the auditorium. It reverberated directly against my sternum. It was a low, mournful D minor, perfectly sustained, drawn out by a bow held with a ruthless, mechanical precision. I watched the rosin dust catch the warm amber spotlight drifting down from the vaulted ceiling of the St. Jude's Academy recital hall. The scent of aged mahogany, floor wax, and the heavy, suffocating cloud of Tom Ford and Chanel perfumes radiating from 500 wealthy Manhattan parents pressed tight against the back of my throat. Arthur shifted in the plush velvet theater seat beside me. The friction of his bespoke charcoal wool suit against the upholstery created a frantic, irregular rhythm. He reached up, his heavy gold Rolex catching the ambient light, his index finger hooking under the knot of his silk tie to pull it a fraction of a millimeter away from his windpipe. A single microscopic bead of moisture sat at the baseline of his hairline. "He's rushing the tempo," Arthur whispered, leaning his weight toward my shoulder, though he was careful not to make physical contact. His breath carried the distinct, sharp notes of 18-year-old Scotch and peppermint breath mints. I didn't turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage, on the 16-year-old boy bathed in the solitary spotlight. "He isn't rushing, Arthur," I replied, the volume of my voice perfectly calibrated to reach only his left ear. "He is dictating the pace. The accompanist is the one failing to keep up." Lucas's chin rested heavily on the dark, polished wood of the instrument. His eyes were closed, his profile a mask of pale, flawless marble. He wore the St. Jude's formal uniform, a navy blazer, crisp white shirt, the crimson and gold-crested tie, but he wore it less like clothing and more like armor. The boy didn't just play the notes, he dominated them. He strangled the melody out of the strings until the audience was forced to synchronize their own breathing with the rise and fall of his bow. I had taught him that. Not the cello I paid a retired maestro from the New York Philharmonic $500 an hour for the technical execution. I had taught him the domination, the absolute, unyielding control over the immediate environment. "If you wait for the world to give you permission to breathe, Lucas, you will suffocate." I had whispered that exact phrase into his ear in the library of our Upper East Side penthouse when he was 7 years old, watching him hesitate before capturing a bishop on the chessboard. He had never hesitated again. The final note echoed, lingering in the dead silence of the hall for 3 agonizing seconds before the applause erupted. It was a deafening, thunderous wave of validation. Arthur instantly rose to his feet. The tension that had been radiating from his spine melted away, replaced by the expansive, chest-puffing arrogance of a man claiming ownership of a masterpiece he had absolutely no hand in creating. He clapped loudly, looking around the VIP section to ensure the other real estate developers, hedge fund managers, and federal judges were observing his paternal triumph. I remained seated for exactly 2 seconds longer than my husband before standing. I did not cheer. I offered a measured, polite applause. Lucas stood up on the stage. He handed the heavy cello to the stagehand without looking at the man. He stepped to the edge of the platform and offered a shallow, highly calculated bow. His dark hair, a striking contrast to the pale skin, fell briefly across his forehead. He didn't smile at the crowd. He scanned the front row until his eyes locked onto mine. The applause washed over him, completely irrelevant. He was waiting for my assessment. I gave him a single, slow nod. A microscopic relaxation in his shoulders occurred. The transaction was complete. He turned and walked into the heavy black curtains of the wings. "Incredible," Arthur breathed out, turning to me, his face flushed with adrenaline. "The dean of admissions from Juilliard is in the 4th row. I saw him taking notes. We need to intercept him at the reception." "Juilliard is a contingency plan," I stated, smoothing the invisible wrinkles from the skirt of my black Dior dress. "The primary objective is the dual degree program at Yale. Musicians are hired for parties, Arthur. The people who write the checks own the venues." Arthur's smile faltered, a slight tightening of the skin around his eyes. He hated when I reminded him of the architecture of power, primarily because he relied entirely on my blueprints to navigate it. Of course. But the optics of a conservatory acceptance. "The optics are flawless," I cut him off, stepping out into the aisle. The crush of the elite crowd instantly parted for us. "Let us go secure the perimeter before the vultures descend on him." The grand foyer of St. Jude's was a monument to old money and quiet intimidation. Arched Gothic windows looked out over the rain-slicked pavement of the Upper West Side. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated silently, balancing silver trays of champagne flutes and miniature caviar tartlets. The ambient noise was a low, sophisticated hum of calculated networking. I accepted a glass of champagne but did not drink it. I used the crystal stem as a grounding point, a physical anchor in the swirling current of the room. Lucas emerged from the backstage corridor 10 minutes later. He had discarded the blazer, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up precisely to the elbow, revealing the lean, corded muscle of a swimmer. He moved through the crowd with a terrifying grace. Adults, CEOs, senators, socialites subconsciously stepped aside to let a 16-year-old boy pass. He didn't acknowledge their deference. He expected it. He walked directly to me, ignoring Arthur, who was currently trapped in a conversation with a zoning commissioner near the ice sculpture. "Your phrasing in the second movement was aggressive," I noted, my eyes scanning the crowd over his shoulder. "The accompanist missed the cue on the transition," Lucas replied, his voice a low, smooth baritone that had settled into his chest over the last year. He picked a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. I had to force the tempo to cover his hesitation. "It won't happen again. I've already requested a replacement for the winter gala." "Efficiency," I murmured. "Ruthlessness," he corrected softly, taking a sip of the water. The corner of his mouth twitched upward. It was a private, mirrored reflection of my own ideology. 16 years. My memory dragged me backward, a violent, involuntary undertow pulling me into the blinding white light of a sterile hospital room on the Upper East Side. 16 years ago, the air had smelled of iodine, blood, and the cheap, cloying vanilla perfume of the woman weeping hysterically in the recovery bed. Jessica Miller. She had been 22, a junior assistant at Arthur's firm. A cliché so aggressively mundane it felt like a personal insult to my intelligence. She possessed the kind of frantic, desperate beauty that dissolved the moment she opened her mouth. Arthur had paid for her apartment in Tribeca. He had paid for the designer bags. He had paid for the illusion of his own lost youth. When the private investigator handed me the manila envelope containing the ultrasound photos and the bank statements, the expected physical reaction, the tears, the rage, the shattered glass never materialized. My heart rate had actually slowed. The architecture of my marriage hadn't collapsed. It had simply revealed its load-bearing flaws. Arthur had fallen to his knees in our foyer when I confronted him. He had wept. He had begged. He swore it was a catastrophic mistake, a moment of weakness, a meaningless biological accident. He offered to pay her off. He offered to send her to Europe. He offered to erase the child entirely. "You cannot erase a bloodline, Arthur," I had told him, looking down at his pathetic, trembling form on the marble floor. "But you can absorb it." I had walked into Jessica's hospital room 3 hours after she gave birth. Arthur waited in the corridor, a terrified, useless sentinel. Jessica was clutching the red-faced, squalling infant to her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and triumphant leverage. She thought the baby was her anchor to the Hayes fortune. She thought she had secured a lifetime annuity. I didn't yell. I pulled a sleek, leather-bound portfolio from my Birkin bag and laid it on the rolling medical tray. $3 million, I had stated, the words entirely devoid of temperature, transferred immediately into an offshore trust in your name. A non-disclosure agreement carrying a penalty of total financial ruin, full irrevocable relinquishment of parental rights. You walk out of this hospital, you get on the private jet waiting at Teterboro, and you never, under any circumstances, return to the state of New York. Jessica had clutched the baby tighter, her cheap vanilla perfume suffocating in the small room. "He's my son. You can't just buy my baby. Arthur loves me." "Arthur is currently vomiting in the men's room near the elevators because the reality of your existence makes him physically ill," I had replied, checking the diamond face of my watch. "You are not a mother to this child, Jessica. You are a liability. If you refuse the contract, my legal team will freeze Arthur's assets pending a highly publicized divorce. You will receive nothing. You will be dragged through the tabloids as a homewrecker, and I will personally ensure this child is raised in the foster system while we litigate the custody for the next decade. The clock is ticking." She had looked at the documents. She had looked at the zeros on the bank transfer authorization. The maternal instinct, weak and entirely transactional, fractured under the weight of the gold. She had signed the papers with a trembling hand, the ink smudging under her tears. I had reached down and taken the infant from her arms. The baby instantly stopped crying the moment his spine rested against my cashmere coat. I didn't look at Jessica again. I walked out of the room, holding the ultimate weapon. Mother. Lucas's voice snapped me back to the present. The grand foyer of the academy, the clinking crystal. I blinked, refocusing my vision. Lucas was staring at a point over my left shoulder. The casual, arrogant posture he maintained had vanished. The muscles in his jaw were locked tight, a rigid, structural tension pulling his face into a mask of pure, concentrated hostility. I turned slowly. The heavy oak doors of the foyer were open, letting in the damp, freezing air of the November night. Standing just inside the threshold, dripping rainwater onto the polished marble, was a woman. She did not belong here. Her trench coat was soaked, the fabric cheap and clinging to a frame that was far too thin. Her blonde hair was a tangled, wet mess plastered to her skull. The dark circles under her eyes were bruised hollows, the skin pallid and drawn. She looked like a ghost that had wandered out of a graveyard and into a masquerade ball. But I recognized the bone structure. I recognized the desperate, frantic energy vibrating in her hands. Jessica, 16 years. The $3 million was supposed to guarantee a permanent exile, but money evaporates when placed in the hands of an addict. The private investigators I kept on retainer to monitor her movements had reported a rapid, catastrophic decline over the last 5 years. Bad investments, worse men, and a narcotics habit that had drained the offshore accounts down to the copper wiring. I knew she was in the city. The alert had hit my encrypted phone 3 days ago. I had allowed her to bypass the security perimeter tonight. I had specifically instructed the head of the academy's security, a man whose mortgage I held, to let the woman matching her description into the lobby. The weapon was fully forged. It was time to test the edge of the blade on a live target. Arthur finally extracted himself from the zoning commissioner. He walked up behind me, raising his glass of scotch to take a celebratory sip. His eyes tracked the direction of my gaze. The crystal tumbler slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, explosive crash. Shards of glass and amber liquid sprayed across the polished stone. The sound severed the low hum of the networking crowd. Dozens of heads turned toward the disturbance. Arthur's face drained of all blood. His skin turned the color of spoiled milk. He took a stumbling step backward, his breath catching in a high, pathetic wheeze. He stared at the dripping woman by the doors, as if the Grim Reaper had just walked in to collect his soul. Jessica didn't look at Arthur. She didn't look at me. Her wide, bloodshot eyes were locked entirely on the tall, dark-haired boy standing perfectly still by my side. "Lucas," Jessica choked out. The sound was a wet, ragged scrape across the silent foyer. She took a step forward. Her wet shoe squeaked violently on the marble. Lucas didn't flinch. He didn't look at Arthur, who was currently hyperventilating against a marble pillar. He looked at me. "Who is the vagrant, Mother?" Lucas asked. His voice was entirely devoid of fluctuation. It was the clinical tone of a scientist observing a dying insect. I took a slow sip of my champagne. The bubbles burned pleasantly against my tongue. "That," I said quietly, ensuring the words resonated perfectly in the space between us, "is the weakness I spent 16 years cutting out of your biology." Shall we see if the surgery was successful? The shattered crystal of Arthur's discarded tumbler lay scattered across the Carrara marble, sharp, glittering fragments catching the ambient light of the chandelier. A single shard, shaped like a jagged crescent moon, rested inches from the toe of my black suede pump. The silence in the foyer was not empty. It was a pressurized vacuum. 500 of Manhattan's most insulated elite had simultaneously ceased their networking, their polite laughter, their consumption of caviar. Their collective gaze, heavy and judgmental, bore down on the wet, trembling anomaly standing in the doorway. The security personnel, 2 broad-shouldered men in tailored black suits, began to move from their posts near the coat check. Their hands drifted instinctually toward their earpieces. I caught the eye of the lead guard, a former NYPD lieutenant whose daughter's private school tuition was discreetly funded by an anonymous philanthropic trust I controlled. I didn't shake my head. I didn't raise my hand. I merely dropped my chin a fraction of a millimeter and held his gaze. The guard stopped. He placed a hand on his partner's chest, halting the intervention. They would allow the anomaly to penetrate the perimeter. They would let the contagion breach the sterile environment because I required the laboratory conditions to observe the reaction. Jessica took another step. The water logged in the cheap, synthetic fabric of her trench coat squeezed out, leaving a dark, muddy footprint on the pristine white stone. The physical degradation of the woman was a masterclass in the corrosive nature of unchecked desperation. 16 years ago, her beauty had been a fragile, mass-produced commodity. Bright blonde hair, symmetrical features, the kind of youth that required no maintenance. Now, the skeletal structure of her face was painfully prominent. The skin stretched thin and sallow over her cheekbones like aged parchment. A violent tremor possessed her hands, a neurological misfire born of chronic substance abuse. She clutched a saturated canvas tote bag to her chest, her knuckles raw and cracked. The scent arrived before she spoke. It bypassed the expensive perfumes of the crowd, a sickening metallic wave of wet dog, stale gin, and the sharp chemical undertone of oxidized copper. Arthur's breathing was a catastrophic failure of lung capacity. In. Short, frantic rasps that failed to reach his diaphragm. He had backed himself entirely against the marble pillar, his fingers desperately seeking purchase on the smooth stone behind him. He looked at Jessica, but his eyes were wide, unfocused, terrified of acknowledging the ghost he had paid $3 million to bury. "Arthur," Jessica whispered. The vocal cords were damaged, the sound rasping like dry leaves dragged across concrete. Arthur didn't answer. He swallowed, a heavy, audible click in his throat. He looked at the floor, specifically at the puddle of spilled scotch and the shattered crystal. Jessica's gaze, hollow and desperate, snapped away from the man who had ruined her and locked entirely onto the boy standing to my left. Lucas had not moved. His posture was a flawless vertical line. His hands rested loosely at his sides, the long, calloused fingers of the cellist completely relaxed. He was analyzing her. I watched the microscopic movements of his dark eyes as they tracked the tremor in her hands, the unnatural dilation of her pupils, the frayed, mud-caked hem of her coat. He was processing the data, categorizing the threat level, and finding it mathematically insignificant. "Lucas," Jessica breathed, the word cracking in the middle. She raised a trembling hand, reaching out across the empty space between them. The gesture was agonizingly slow, a pathetic attempt to bridge a 16-year void with a single touch. "My God, look at you. You have his jaw. You have." She choked on a sob, her chest heaving beneath the soaked trench coat. The sound was wet, primitive, an ugly display of raw biological imperative completely unfiltered by social conditioning. The crowd around us collectively flinched. A woman dripping in Cartier diamonds, standing 2 feet away, pulled her mink, stole tighter around her throat, disgusted by the sheer proximity of the raw emotion. Lucas tilted his head. The movement was slow, deliberate, mimicking the precise angle I used when examining a poorly executed forgery at the museum. "I am unfamiliar with the protocol for addressing vagrants inside a private institution," Lucas said. His voice projected effortlessly, carrying the smooth, resonant acoustic properties he utilized on the cello. He didn't lower his volume. He wanted the audience. He turned his head slightly to address me, though his eyes remained fixed on Jessica. "Did the Academy initiate a charity outreach program without notifying the student body mother?" The word mother hit the damp air of the foyer like a sniper's bullet. Jessica flinched, a violent, full-body spasm. The trembling hand she had extended toward him dropped to her side, slapping against her thigh. Her mouth opened, exposing a row of teeth that had suffered significantly over the last decade. Jessica stammered, her eyes darting frantically from Lucas to me. The realization of the architecture I had built around her biological byproduct crashed into her drug-addled mind. She saw the cut of his suit, the flawless diction, the absolute, chilling detachment in his eyes. She saw the ghost of her own genetics, scrubbed entirely clean, replaced by my software. No, I'm your. She couldn't say the word. The sheer, crushing weight of my presence, standing beside the boy, paralyzed her vocal cords. I took a slow, measured step forward, placing myself marginally between Lucas and the trembling woman. I didn't shield him. I framed him. "You appear to be deeply disoriented," I stated, keeping my voice modulated to a low, soothing hum, the tone one might use to address a rabid animal before the lethal injection takes effect. "The weather is exceptionally brutal tonight. I suspect you wandered through the service entrance seeking shelter." The security personnel will assist you in finding a more appropriate facility. Jessica's head snapped toward me. The hollow exhaustion in her eyes ignited into a sudden, erratic flare of manic rage. "Don't," she hissed, a spray of saliva catching the chandelier light. She took a lurching step toward me, closing the distance to 3 feet. The metallic, chemical smell was overpowering. "Don't you dare talk to me like I'm trash, Madeline. You know exactly who I am. You took him, you bought him, and you turned him into this cold little machine." "I provided an environment conducive to excellence," I replied smoothly, ignoring the accusation, my gaze dropping to the ruined state of her fingernails. "A concept that seems fundamentally foreign to your current operational capacity." "Artie!" Jessica suddenly shrieked, pivoting away from me to hurl the desperation at the marble pillar. "Artie, tell him who I am. Tell him you promised." The crowd gasped, a collective, sharp intake of breath. The whispered murmurs intensified, a hive of elite bees smelling blood. Artie. The diminutive nickname was a vulgarity in this space. It stripped the real estate tycoon of his armor, exposing the messy, pathetic reality of a man who engaged with the underbelly of the city. Arthur peeled himself away from the pillar. His charcoal suit felt suddenly 3 sizes too big. He raised a hand, his palm facing outward in a gesture of pathetic surrender. I don't know this woman," Arthur stammered, his voice thin, lacking all resonance. The lie was so poorly constructed, so structurally unsound, it practically dissolved the moment it left his lips. "Security, escort this disturbed individual off the premises immediately." The 2 guards, finally receiving the explicit verbal command from a board member, moved forward, closing the distance rapidly. Jessica saw the black suits approaching from her peripheral vision. Panic, sharp and feral, seized her features. She backed away, her wet shoes slipping on the marble. She reached into the saturated canvas tote bag clutched against her chest. "You stop the transfers!" Jessica screamed, the words tearing out of her throat, desperate to inflict maximum damage before the extraction. She pulled a crumpled, water-damaged stack of paper from the bag, waving it frantically in the air. "You stopped the wire transfers to the Delaware account 3 months ago. The men in Queens? They're going to break my legs, Artie. You promised you would keep me safe if I stayed away. You promised." The guards grabbed her arms. They were efficient, applying immediate leverage to her joints, forcing her backward toward the heavy oak doors. She fought them, twisting her emaciated frame with the manic strength of a cornered addict, dropping the crumpled papers onto the floor in the struggle. "Tell him!" Jessica shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling as they dragged her across the threshold into the freezing rain. "Look at his eyes! He's mine! He's mine!" The heavy oak doors slammed shut. The physical anomaly was removed. The silence rushed back in, but it was fundamentally altered. The vacuum had been filled with a toxic gas. I didn't look at the doors. I didn't look at the crowd. I slowly lowered my gaze to the floor. The crumpled stack of papers Jessica had dropped lay resting near the shattered crystal of Arthur's glass. My heart did not race. My pulse remained a steady, rhythmic metronome, but a deep, profound tectonic shift occurred in the architecture of my reality. The transfers to the Delaware account. 16 years ago, the $3 million had been transferred to a trust in the Cayman Islands, structured to disperse a monthly annuity to ensure her survival without requiring direct contact. The account was supposed to be blind. It was supposed to be a fire-and-forget missile. I managed the ledger. I monitored the depletion of the funds. The Cayman account had hit a zero balance exactly 14 months ago. I had documented the financial exhaustion with a sense of clinical satisfaction, calculating her inevitable demise on the streets. There was no Delaware account in the original architecture. I turned my head with agonizing slowness. I looked at Arthur. He was staring at the crumpled papers on the floor. His entire body was vibrating, a fine, high-frequency tremor that shook the fabric of his trousers. The sweat had broken past his hairline, tracking down his temple. His jaw hung slightly open, pulling air into his lungs in ragged, desperate gasps. He looked like a man standing on a trapdoor, waiting for the lever to be pulled. He had maintained contact. For 16 years, while I meticulously scrubbed the biological taint from the boy, while I structured every micro-interaction to ensure the absolute eradication of Jessica's influence, my husband had been silently funneling capital through a domestic shell account to keep the parasite alive. He had built a backdoor into my fortress. He had allowed the weakness to persist. Mother. Lucas's voice was a flat, dead frequency. I shifted my gaze to him. He was not looking at the door where the woman had vanished. He was not looking at Arthur. He was staring at the papers on the floor, his head tilted at the precise angle of a predator, analyzing a fresh blood trail. The structural integrity of this event has been compromised, Lucas stated, stepping forward. His polished Oxford shoe crushed a fragment of the broken crystal into powder. He reached down, his long fingers closing around the damp, crumpled stack of papers. Lucas, leave that, Arthur croaked, lunging forward, his hand extending in a pathetic attempt to intercept the documents. Lucas didn't pull the papers away. He simply straightened his spine, utilizing his 2-inch height advantage over his father to look down the bridge of his nose. The expression on the boy's face was a masterpiece of engineered disdain. Your hand is shaking, father, Lucas observed, his voice dropping into a chillingly quiet register. It suggests a severe lack of fine motor control. I advise you not to touch items that require steady handling. Arthur froze, his hands suspended in the air. The absolute humiliation of being disciplined by his own creation paralyzed him. Lucas unspooled the crumpled papers, his thumbs smoothing out the damp creases. He scanned the top sheet. His dark eyes flicked left to right, rapidly processing the data points. I watched the microscopic tightening of his jaw, the slight flare of his nostrils. He didn't read the document aloud. He didn't ask questions. He simply folded the papers with meticulous precision and slid them into the inner breast pocket of his crisp white shirt. The headmaster's private study is located down the east corridor, I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, expectant silence of the foyer. I didn't look at the crowd. I didn't need to. They would feed on this spectacle for weeks, but the immediate crisis required containment. We will occupy it until the vehicle arrives. I turned on my heel and walked toward the arched corridor. I didn't check to see if they followed. The gravitational pull of my authority was absolute. I heard the sharp, rhythmic click of Lucas's shoes matching my pace, a perfect, synchronized echo. Behind him, the dragging, hesitant shuffle of a man walking to his own execution. The headmaster's study was a sanctuary of dark wood, leather-bound encyclopedias, and the heavy scent of pipe tobacco. The door clicked shut behind us, severing the ambient noise of the reception. A heavy brass carriage clock ticked relentlessly on the mantel above the unlit fireplace. I walked to the center of the Persian rug and turned around. Arthur collapsed into a wingback leather chair. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with silent, pathetic tremors. He looked small. A titan of commercial real estate reduced to a crumbling pile of bespoke wool and terror. Lucas did not sit. He walked to the heavy mahogany desk, turned, and leaned the small of his back against the edge, crossing his ankles. He pulled the folded papers from his pocket and held them between his index and middle finger, tapping the edge rhythmically against his thigh. Tap, tap, tap. The sound synchronized perfectly with the ticking of the carriage clock. I stood directly in front of Arthur's chair. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't project anger. I simply allowed the absolute zero of my internal temperature to radiate outward. A Delaware account, Arthur? I said quietly. Arthur flinched, as if I had struck him with a physical blow. He slowly lowered his hands, revealing a face ravaged by the sudden aging of a collapsed lie. The redness in his cheeks had faded to an ashen gray. Maddie, please, Arthur begged, the nickname a desperate, vulgar attempt at intimacy. You don't understand the pressure. You don't understand the guilt. Guilt, I repeated the word, dissecting it, finding the concept entirely foreign and utterly useless. Guilt is a biological defect designed to enforce social cohesion among the weak. You are a man who demolished a low-income housing project in the Bronx to build a luxury fitness center. You do not possess the capacity for genuine guilt. You possess the capacity for fear. She threatened me, Arthur choked out, his eyes darting frantically toward Lucas, who was watching the exchange with the detached fascination of a coroner performing an autopsy. 5 years ago, when the Cayman money ran out, she found my private line at the firm. She said she was going to the press. She said she was going to tell the world that the heir to the Hayes empire was the bastard son of a junior assistant. And instead of engaging the legal team to annihilate her, I analyzed, the timeline locking into place with sickening clarity. Instead of utilizing the non-disclosure agreement to strip her of her remaining dignity, you capitulated to the extortion of a drug addict. You built a backdoor funding mechanism to keep the threat alive. I was protecting the boy, Arthur practically shouted, a sudden desperate flare of defensive rage pushing him forward in the chair. He pointed a trembling finger at Lucas. I was protecting his reputation. If the board found out, if the media got hold of it, it would ruin his chances at Yale. It would ruin his position in the firm. I paid her to stay invisible. You paid a parasite to remain attached to the host, Lucas corrected. The voice did not come from me. Arthur's head snapped toward the mahogany desk. Lucas had stopped tapping the papers against his thigh. He stood up straight, unfolding the damp documents once more. The ambient light from the desk lamp caught the sharp, predatory angle of his cheekbones. I am currently reviewing a ledger of wire transfers executed from a shell corporation named Apex Holdings LLC, registered in Wilmington, Delaware, Lucas stated, his voice a smooth, uninterrupted flow of data. The beneficiary is a checking account under the name Jessica Miller. The transfers occur on the first of every month. $5,000. A pathetic sum for a billionaire, but a functional fortune for a narcotics dependency. Arthur stared at his son, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Lucas, you need to hand those papers to your mother. This is a complex adult matter. The final transfer documented here, Lucas continued, entirely ignoring his father's pathetic attempt to re-establish authority, occurred exactly 3 months ago. Following that date, the ledger shows 3 failed attempts by the beneficiary to initiate a reverse wire. The account was frozen. Lucas raised his eyes from the paper. He looked directly at Arthur. You froze the account, father, Lucas deduced, the analytical speed terrifying in its precision. Why? Arthur shrank back into the leather chair. The sweat was pooling in the collar of his shirt. He looked at me, pleading silently for an intervention, a rescue. I offered him nothing. I stood perfectly still, watching the software I had coded for 16 years execute its primary function. The zoning board investigation, Arthur finally whispered, the words slipping out in a defeated exhale. The feds started looking into the shell companies attached to the firm regarding the Hudson Yards project. They were auditing the secondary LLCs. Apex Holdings was vulnerable. I couldn't risk the auditors tracing the monthly dispersals to a woman with a history of narcotics arrests. I had to freeze the account to sever the link until the audit cleared. You severed her life support to protect a real estate deal, Lucas translated, a dark, chilling amusement creeping into the edges of his voice. I was protecting the family, Arthur cried, genuine tears welling in the corners of his eyes, a pathetic display of emotional incontinence. You were protecting your own cowardice, I stated, the final nail in the coffin of his authority. I turned to look at Lucas. The boy held the biological evidence of his own mother's extortion. The secret I had buried was now an active, explosive device in the center of the room. It was time to dictate the narrative before the boy attempted to write his own. The woman in the foyer, Lucas, I began, my voice steady, projecting absolute, unshakable reality, is a biological technicality. 16 years ago, your father engaged in a catastrophic lapse of judgment. The resulting pregnancy was an error in the system. I corrected the error. I purchased the rights to your existence. I excised her from the narrative, and I built the architecture of your life. You are a haze not by blood, but by my design. I watched his face. I watched the micro-expressions. I expected a flicker of betrayal, a sudden, violent surge of teenage identity crisis. The realization that the woman he called mother was a warden, and the vagrant in the foyer was his blood. Lucas looked down at the papers in his hand. He folded them slowly, aligning the edges with meticulous, obsessive precision. Then he smiled. It wasn't the polite, calculated smirk he used for the elite crowd in the foyer. It was a slow, terrifying curvature of the lips that reached his dark eyes, igniting a cold, brilliant fire in the depths. It was the smile of a predator realizing the cage door had just been left open. A biological technicality. Lucas repeated the phrase, rolling the syllables over his tongue as if tasting a rare vintage. He looked up at me, the smile settling into a mask of pure, unadulterated ambition. You assumed I didn't know, mother. The carriage clock on the mantel ticked. The sound was suddenly deafening. I did not physically recoil. I did not allow my breathing to shift. but the internal structure of my absolute control sustained a massive concussive fracture. Explain the parameter of your knowledge, I demanded, my voice dropping an octave, slipping into the command register. Lucas slid the folded papers back into his pocket. He walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany desk, closing the distance between us until he stood barely 2 feet away. The boy was 16, but he possessed the gravitational density of a black hole. I was 9 years old when I required a blood transfusion following the accident at the equestrian center, Lucas stated, his voice a low, steady hum. The attending physician informed you that my blood type was O negative. Father is AB positive. You are A positive. The biological impossibility was glaring. I observed the subsequent alteration of the medical records you orchestrated before the insurance company processed the claim. My mind raced backward. The shattered collarbone, the emergency room at Mount Sinai, the panicked resident. I had paid the chief of surgery a staggering sum to scrub the blood type discrepancy from the digital files. I had assumed the 9-year-old child, heavily sedated on painkillers, was completely oblivious to the transaction occurring at the foot of his bed. I did not confront you, Lucas continued, reading the rapid calculation in my eyes. Confrontation without leverage is a tactical error. I simply began to observe the anomalies in the environment, the distinct lack of infant photographs prior to my 3rd month, the way Father's eyes flinched whenever my temper flared, searching for a ghost he recognized. The monthly encrypted phone calls Father took in his study on the 1st of every month. Utilizing a burner device he kept locked in the lower right drawer of his desk. Arthur let out a low, pathetic moan from the chair, burying his head entirely between his knees. You investigated, I said, a strange, terrifying pride blooming amidst the wreckage of my secret. I had built the machine too well. The software was self-auditing. I accessed his private ledger 3 years ago, Lucas confirmed, glancing down at the trembling mass of wool that was his father. I traced the wire transfers from Apex Holdings to the account under the name Jessica Miller. A simple cross-reference of human resources archives from the firm circa my birth year provided the final data point, a junior assistant who vanished from the payroll exactly 1 month before my date of birth. He had known. For 3 years, the boy had sat across from me at the dining table, executing flawless cello sonatas, securing top honors at St. Jude's, fully aware that I was the architect of his stolen identity, and he had never dropped the mask. Why did you withhold the data? I asked, my voice barely a whisper, fascinated by the depth of his deception. Lucas took a final step closer. The scent of rosin dust and adrenaline radiated from his skin. Because the data was not yet weaponized, Lucas replied softly, looking directly into my eyes. Knowledge is a dormant asset, Mother. It only generates yield when applied at the precise point of maximum structural vulnerability. If I revealed my knowledge at 12, I was a confused child demanding answers. I possessed no capital. But tonight, he slowly turned his head to look at the heavy oak door of the study, the barrier separating us from the lobby where the biological ghost had just been dragged into the storm. Tonight, the ghost materialized. Lucas finished, a dark, thrilling resonance vibrating in his chest. And Father's infrastructure collapsed in front of 500 witnesses. The vulnerability has presented itself. What is your objective, Lucas? I asked, stripping away the maternal facade entirely, engaging him as a pure, strategic adversary. The objective is ownership, Lucas stated, turning back to me, the cold fire in his eyes burning brighter. Father has proven himself fundamentally compromised. He operates on a foundation of cowardice and emotional vulnerability. He froze the account to protect an audit, triggering an erratic, desperate addict to crash a public venue, thereby jeopardizing the entire Hayes legacy. He is a liability. Arthur slowly lifted his head from his knees. His face was streaked with sweat and tears, a mask of total ruination. Lucas, please, I'm your father. I built this empire for you. Lucas didn't look at him. He kept his eyes locked on mine. He built a vulnerability. I require the vulnerability excised. To what end? I pressed, testing the structural integrity of his ambition. The trust, Lucas said, the word dropping into the quiet room like a heavy stone. The Hayes Primary Trust is scheduled to transfer 30% of the voting shares to my control upon my 21st birthday. The remaining 70% requires father's death or his legal incapacitation to disperse. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the damp, crumpled wire transfer ledgers. He held them up between us. These documents, Lucas murmured, combined with the security footage of a narcotics addict screaming about a promised payout in the foyer of a private academy, constitute a massive liability. The board of directors were to receive an anonymous packet detailing the CEO's decades-long extortion payments to a former employee, combined with the current federal audit of the shell companies utilized to make those payments. The board would force a medical leave of absence. They would demand a psychological evaluation. My breath hitched. The sheer, blinding sociopathy of the strategy was breathtaking. He wasn't just analyzing the board. He was planning to execute his own father to accelerate his acquisition of the empire. You intend to blackmail him into early abdication, I said, a slow, dark smile mirroring his own curving my lips. The surgery hadn't just been successful. The patient had surpassed the surgeon. I intend to utilize the tools you provided, Mother, Lucas replied smoothly. But a forced abdication requires a seamless transition of power. The board will not hand 70% of the voting shares to a 16-year-old boy. They will require a proxy, a stable, ruthless, uncompromised regent to hold the throne until I come of age. He offered me the crumpled papers, the keys to the kingdom. I require a partner, Lucas whispered. I looked at the damp papers. I looked at the broken, weeping man in the leather chair, the husband who had betrayed me twice, first by creating the bastard, and second by secretly keeping the mother alive. I looked at the boy I had raised from the ashes of that betrayal, a flawless, terrifying weapon of my own design. I reached out and took the papers from his hand. The damp paper felt heavy, charged with catastrophic potential. The board will require absolute proof of his incapacitation, I stated, the gears of the machine already grinding, locking into a new lethal configuration. A scandal is messy. A scandal tanks the stock price before we can consolidate the shares. We require a cleaner narrative. Lucas tilted his head, his dark eyes shining with anticipation. What is your proposed architecture? I turned slowly, walking toward the wingback chair where Arthur sat shivering in his bespoke suit. I stopped inches from his knees, looking down at the man who had thought he could control the monsters he created. Your father, I said, my voice ringing with absolute clinical authority, is suffering from severe, acute psychological stress. The pressure of the federal audit has fractured his cognitive function. He is hallucinating threats. He is engaging in erratic, self-destructive behavior. He requires immediate aggressive psychiatric intervention at a secure private facility in Switzerland. Arthur's eyes went wide. The terror in his chest expanded, crushing his lungs. Maddie, no, you can't. I'm not crazy. You can't lock me away. The narrative is already established, Arthur, I whispered, leaning down, my face inches from his sweating forehead. You just had a complete public breakdown in front of the entire St. Jude's administration. You were screaming at a vagrant. The stress has clearly broken you. I straightened up, turning back to Lucas. The transfer of the proxy shares requires his signature before the medical transport arrives. I instructed the boy. The legal team will draft the documents tonight, but the narrative requires a catalyst. It requires the board to see the absolute, irrefutable danger his breakdown poses to the firm. Lucas's eyes narrowed slightly, processing the missing variable. What is the catalyst? The vagrant, I said, the words slipping off my tongue like a drop of poison. The biological technicality shivering in the rain. I walked to the mahogany desk, picking up the heavy brass telephone receiver. I dialed the direct line to the head of the Academy's security. Lieutenant, I said, the moment the line connected, the disturbed woman who was removed from the premises. I assume your men merely deposited her on the sidewalk? Yes, Mrs. Hayes. Standard protocol. She was heading south toward the subway station on 72nd. Excellent. Dispatch a private vehicle. Locate her immediately. Do not involve the NYPD. Bring her to the loading dock of the Hayes Foundation building downtown. Secure her in the subterranean holding room. Inform no one. I hung up the receiver. The heavy clack echoed in the silent study. Lucas was watching me, his posture perfectly rigid, the analytical fire burning intensely in his dark eyes. He recognized the escalation. The blackmail was a blunt instrument. I was drafting a symphony of destruction. You are bringing the biological variable back into the controlled environment, Lucas observed. Why? Because, Lucas, I said, walking slowly back to the center of the Persian rug, feeling the absolute terrifying alignment of the universe. Blackmailing your father requires hiding the weakness. To truly destroy him and to secure the empire without damaging the stock price, we must publicize the weakness under our own controlled narrative. I looked at Arthur, curled into a pathetic ball in the chair. Your father, I continued, speaking to Lucas but keeping my eyes fixed on the broken man, in a fit of stress-induced psychosis, has been embezzling company funds to pay off a delusional stalker, a woman he claims he doesn't know, but who has been harassing the family for years. When the stalker crashed the recital tonight, his fragile mind snapped. I turned to Lucas, offering him the final piece of the architecture. Tomorrow morning, Arthur will sign over the proxy voting rights to secure my protection. Then, he will board a private medical transport to Geneva, I stated, the blueprint flawless, lethal, and absolute. And you, Lucas, are going to take a trip downtown to the holding room. You are going to sit across a table from the woman who gave birth to you. Lucas did not flinch. The mention of his biological mother did not trigger a single micro-expression of empathy or hesitation. What is my objective in the holding room? Lucas asked, his voice a low, steady hum of absolute compliance. I smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth that reflected perfectly in the dark, empty voids of my son's eyes. You are going to teach her, I whispered, the words carrying the full, devastating weight of 16 years of vengeance. Exactly how much a mother's love is worth when it stands in the way of a hostile takeover. The hum of the subterranean ventilation system was a low, industrial drone that vibrated through the soles of my Prada stilettos. The sub-basement of the Hayes Foundation building on Wall Street had originally been designed as a high-security document vault. The walls were 2 feet of solid, reinforced concrete, intended to withstand a blast radius. The air down here was entirely synthetic, scrubbed of moisture and scent, maintaining a sterile, freezing baseline of 62 degrees. I stood in the absolute darkness of the observation corridor. My fingertips rested lightly against the surface of the two-way mirror. The glass was thick, cold, and soundproofed, offering a pristine, high-definition view into the illuminated holding room on the other side. Jessica Miller sat in a steel folding chair in the exact center of the stark white room. The Academy security personnel had stripped her of the saturated trench coat, wrapping her narrow, shivering shoulders in a coarse gray utility blanket. The withdrawal was beginning to set into her marrow. Her right knee bounced with a frantic, uncontrolled velocity, the rubber sole of her ruined shoe squeaking a rapid rhythm against the polished epoxy floor. She was scratching at the inside of her left forearm, her jagged, dirty fingernails dragging across the pale, translucent skin, leaving angry red welts in their wake. Her blonde hair, dried by the harsh ambient air, stood in dull, matted clumps around her sunken face. She looked entirely feral, a biological error trapped under a microscope. The heavy steel door of the holding room clicked open. The sound, transmitted through the discreet audio speaker mounted above the mirror in my observation corridor, was sharp and metallic. Lucas stepped into the room. He had discarded the formal academy uniform. He wore a dark, charcoal cashmere turtleneck and black tailored trousers. The dark fabric absorbed the harsh fluorescent light, making him appear as a solid, impenetrable silhouette against the sterile white walls. He moved with a terrifying, silent fluidity. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind him, the pneumatic seal locking them into the vault. Jessica's head snapped up, her bouncing knee instantly stilled. The scratching ceased. She stared at the tall, broad-shouldered young man standing near the door, her bloodshot eyes widening to absorb the sheer, physical reality of him. Lucas did not approach the metal table. He remained near the perimeter, his hands resting loosely in his pockets, his posture a flawless vertical column. He tilted his head a fraction of an inch, the dark eyes conducting a rapid, clinical sweep of her physical degradation. Lucas, Jessica breathed, the word carrying a wet, pathetic rattle through the audio feed. She clutched the edges of the gray blanket, pulling it tighter around her throat, a subconscious attempt to shield her ruined state from his pristine evaluation. You came down here. She didn't come. You came. A delusion of alliance instantly bloomed in her hollow eyes. She interpreted his presence as an act of rebellion against me. My mother is currently engaged in the finalization of the medical transport logistics for Arthur, Lucas stated. His baritone was smooth, echoing slightly against the concrete walls. The deliberate use of my title and the casual dismissal of Arthur's biological label was a flawless opening maneuver. Jessica flinched at the word mother. A violent, full-body spasm rippled under the gray blanket. "She is not your mother," Jessica hissed, the venom briefly overriding the narcotic withdrawal. She leaned forward, the steel chair scraping loudly against the epoxy floor. "She bought you. She threatened me, Lucas. I was young. I was terrified. She told me if I didn't sign the papers, she would ruin Arthur, and I would end up in a gutter without my baby. She stole you from me." "The concept of theft requires the prior existence of ownership," Lucas countered, his voice dropping into a lower, chillingly calm register. He slowly paced a 3-foot line along the back wall, observing her from a peripheral angle. "A biological transaction occurred. Capital was exchanged for raw material. You accepted $3 million, Jessica. You traded the raw material for an offshore account." Jessica's jaw dropped. The breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, audible gasp. She stared at the 16-year-old boy, searching for a trace of childhood, a flicker of emotional vulnerability to exploit. She found a titanium vault. "I did it for you," Jessica cried, a sudden desperate tear cutting a clean track through the grime on her cheek. "I thought the money would let me build a life for us. I thought Arthur would leave her and come find me, but she blocked everything. She locked me out. And when the money ran out, Artie promised he would take care of me. He promised." Arthur constructed a secondary funding mechanism, Lucas confirmed, stopping his pacing to face her directly. "The Delaware account, $5,000 on the first of every month. A pathetic drip feed of capital designed to purchase his own peace of mind." "He froze it," Jessica sobbed, her hands coming up to cover her face, her shoulders shaking violently. "3 months ago, no warning, the men in Queens, my landlord. They started looking for me. I was starving, Lucas. I had nothing. I tried to call the burner number. It was disconnected. He left me to die. I watched through the glass, my posture perfectly rigid." The narrative was unfolding exactly according to the parameters I had established. Arthur's cowardice had forced her hand. The pressure had created the diamond we were currently using to cut his throat. Lucas was simply gathering the verbal confirmation of the extortion to seal the proxy transfer. But Lucas didn't pull a digital recorder from his pocket. He didn't ask her to sign a written confession. He slowly pulled his hands from his pockets and rested them on the back of the metal chair opposite Jessica. He leaned his weight forward, bringing his face into the direct glare of the overhead lights. "Arthur did not freeze the Delaware account, Jessica," Lucas said. The audio feed in my corridor seemed to amplify, the static hissing in my ears. The temperature of the synthetic air surrounding me suddenly felt invasive, piercing through the layers of my Dior dress. Jessica slowly lowered her hands. Her mascara was smeared across her cheekbones in dark, jagged streaks. She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "Arthur is a creature of absolute habit, driven entirely by risk aversion," Lucas continued, his dark eyes locking onto her bloodshot gaze. "He would never voluntarily sever the funding. The threat of your exposure was too catastrophic for his fragile psychological structure to process. He would have paid you until the day his heart failed." "Then who?" Jessica stammered, her fingers digging into the coarse fabric of the blanket. "I executed a localized infiltration of the Apex Holdings banking portal 90 days ago," Lucas stated, the words slipping from his mouth with the casual precision of a surgeon making a primary incision. The cybersecurity protocols on the shell company were severely outdated. A simple brute force algorithm bypassed the two-factor authentication. I altered the routing numbers for the automated dispersal. I severed the connection. My pulse, previously a steady, controlled rhythm, suffered a massive, arrhythmic stutter. The vibration in the floor seemed to crawl up my legs, turning my muscles to stone. I pressed my palms flat against the cold glass. He severed the connection. Arthur hadn't frozen the account to protect the federal audit. Arthur had been telling the truth in the study. The panic in his eyes wasn't just the fear of exposure. It was the sheer, blinding confusion of a man whose safety net had vanished without his command. Lucas had starved her. "You?" Jessica whispered. the word barely carrying over the hum of the HVAC. The delusion of alliance shattered instantly, replaced by a creeping, primal terror. She shrank back into the metal chair, pulling her knees up toward her chest. Why? I am your mother. Why would you do that to me? Because a dormant asset is entirely useless, Lucas replied, walking around the chair, closing the distance to the metal table. He sat down directly across from her. The physical proximity forced Jessica to press her spine against the back of her chair. For 3 years, I possessed the knowledge of your existence. I monitored the financial lifeline Arthur provided. But as long as you were comfortable, you remained invisible. As long as Arthur paid you, his structural vulnerability remained hidden beneath the surface. He leaned closer, resting his elbows on the metal table, interlacing his long fingers. I required a crisis, Lucas murmured. I required Arthur to experience a catastrophic, public failure of his infrastructure, and I required the architect of my life to realize that her fortress was built on a fault line, the architect of his life. The oxygen in the observation corridor evaporated. A crushing, localized pressure settled directly over my sternum. The air grew impossibly thin. I took a sharp, shallow breath, the sound deafening in the isolated darkness. He wasn't talking to Jessica. He was performing for the mirror. I tracked the IP address of your desperate, frantic searches at the Queen's Public Library when the funds failed to clear, Lucas continued, his dark eyes never leaving Jessica's terrified face, but the cadence of his voice explicitly directed at the microphone above his head. I mapped your physical decline. I monitored the eviction notices. I waited until the chemical dependency reached the point of critical mass, until the desperation overrode your fear of Madeline. You made me come here, Jessica choked out, her entire body shaking violently now, the narcotic withdrawal compounding with the absolute, freezing horror of the revelation. The burner phone. The text message last night. That wasn't Artie. Arthur does not possess the operational intelligence to utilize an encrypted messaging application, Lucas confirmed, a faint, chilling smile touching the corners of his mouth. I dispatched the coordinates of the St. Jude's recital. I explicitly instructed you to bypass the security perimeter at exactly 8:45 p.m. I provided the specific phrasing regarding the Delaware account to ensure maximum psychological damage to Arthur upon your arrival. The floor beneath my stilettos ceased to exist. I was in a freefall. The timeline rewrote itself with violent, catastrophic velocity, tearing through the pristine logic I had constructed. Lucas hadn't merely observed the crisis in the foyer. He was the architect of the crisis. He had manipulated the security protocols. He had weaponized the biological mother he had never met. He had orchestrated the exact moment of Arthur's public collapse, knowing I would instantly exploit the situation to seize the proxy shares and lock Arthur in a Swiss clinic. I hadn't been guiding him toward the hostile takeover. He had been hurting me. You are a monster, Jessica gasped, pressing her hands against her ears, trying to block out the smooth, terrifying resonance of his voice. She turned you into a monster. You starved your own mother to steal a company. I accelerated the inevitable, Lucas corrected softly. He reached into the inner pocket of his cashmere turtleneck. My eyes locked onto his hand. The movement was slow, deliberate. He did not pull out the crumpled wire transfer ledgers. He pulled out a sleek, matte black digital recording device. He placed it gently in the exact center of the metal table. A tiny red LED light pulsed on its surface, a rhythmic synchronized heartbeat in the sterile room. Pulse, pulse, pulse. The documents I secured from your canvas tote bag in the foyer were sufficient to compromise Arthur, Lucas stated, his gaze finally breaking away from Jessica. He turned his head. He looked directly at the two-way mirror. He looked directly into my eyes. The illusion of the one-way barrier vanished. He couldn't see me in the darkness of the corridor, but the absolute, unwavering precision of his stare confirmed he knew exactly where I was standing, exactly where my hands were pressed against the glass, exactly how rapidly my pulse was tearing through my carotid artery. But Arthur is a secondary target, Lucas said, speaking directly to the glass, his voice bypassing the microphone and echoing straight into my skull. His removal was simply a necessary logistical step to isolate the primary vulnerability. He reached out and tapped the flashing red light of the digital recorder. The primary vulnerability, Lucas continued, the chilling smile expanding, reaching the dark, empty voids of his eyes. Is the woman standing in the dark, believing she holds the master key to the empire? A cold, paralyzing dread, entirely foreign and deeply toxic, flooded my veins. The muscles in my jaw locked. I tried to swallow, but my throat was entirely dry. "What is that?" Jessica whispered, staring at the flashing red light, oblivious to the silent war being waged through the mirror. "This," Lucas said, keeping his eyes locked on the glass, "is the culmination of a 3-year observation period. A highly sensitive, continuously looping audio interceptor." He leaned back in his chair, adopting the relaxed, imperial posture I had modeled for him since he was a child. "You taught me that knowledge is a dormant asset, Madeline." Lucas recited my own ideology back to me, the ultimate, lethal reflection. "You taught me to only apply it at the precise point of maximum structural vulnerability." Tonight, in the headmaster's study, Arthur's infrastructure collapsed. But you were so focused on securing his proxy shares, so consumed by the absolute brilliance of your own architecture, that you failed to monitor your own perimeter. My mind raced, frantically scanning the memory of the study. The heavy oak doors, the carriage clock, Arthur weeping in the leather chair. "I intend to utilize the tools you provided, Mother. What is your proposed architecture?" "The board will require absolute proof of his incapacitation. A scandal is messy. We require a cleaner narrative. Your father, in a fit of stress-induced psychosis, has been embezzling company funds to pay off a delusional stalker. Tomorrow morning, Arthur will sign over the proxy voting rights to secure my protection. Then, he will board a private medical transport to Geneva. The entire conspiracy, the explicit verbal blueprint of the hostile takeover, the medical kidnapping of Arthur Hayes, the manipulation of the board. I had spoken it all aloud. I had dictated the destruction of my husband to the son I was training, and the son had recorded every single syllable. The audio file currently residing on this device, Lucas stated, his voice a smooth, vibrating hum of absolute power, contains the explicit, undeniable confession of a conspiracy to commit medical fraud, extortion, and the hostile usurpation of a multi-billion-dollar corporate entity. It features the primary orchestrator detailing the exact methodology of the crime. He picked up the recorder, turning it over in his long fingers, watching the red light reflect on the metal table. If this file is transmitted to the federal authorities, Arthur will be immediately extracted from your custody. He will be granted immunity in exchange for his testimony regarding the shell companies. Lucas outlined the catastrophic reality of the trap closing around me, and the board of directors, terrified of the federal indictments, will sever all ties with the orchestrator. The proxy shares you intend to secure tomorrow morning will be entirely voided by a criminal conviction. He placed the recorder back on the table and pushed it an inch toward the mirror. You built a flawless machine to destroy Arthur. Lucas whispered to the glass, his eyes shining with a dark, terrifying adoration for the lethal trap he had sprung. But you installed a backdoor in the code, Madeline. You let me watch you build it. The air in the observation corridor grew heavy, pushing against my chest with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. The absolute zero of my internal temperature fractured, replaced by a searing, blinding panic. I had raised a sociopath to execute my enemies. I had systematically removed every trace of empathy, every biological weakness, every hesitation from his psyche. I had sharpened the blade to an atomic edge, and the blade had just turned in my hand. Jessica stared at Lucas, her jaw trembling violently. The complexity of the corporate espionage was beyond her degraded cognitive function, but she understood the shift in power. She understood that the boy across the table was infinitely more dangerous than the woman who had bought him. "Lucas," Jessica pleaded, her voice dropping to a terrified, desperate whisper. She reached out, her dirty, trembling fingers brushing against the sleeve of his cashmere sweater. "Please, I did what you asked. I went to the recital." I screamed at Arthur. "You have what you want now. You have the recording. You promised." The text message said, "If I did this, you would give me the money. You would let me leave the city." Lucas slowly turned his head away from the mirror. He looked down at the dirty hand resting on his expensive cashmere. He didn't pull his arm away. He simply stared at her fingers with a look of pure, clinical revulsion. "I promised the restoration of your financial baseline in exchange for your performance," Lucas acknowledged, his tone entirely devoid of the lethal intensity he had directed at the glass. He was addressing a discarded tool. "Then let me go," Jessica sobbed, the tears flowing freely now, carving clean lines through the grime on her face. "Give me the money. Let me disappear. I won't ever come back. I swear to God, Lucas. I just want to survive." Lucas reached into his trouser pocket. He withdrew a thick, sealed white envelope. It was heavy, bulging with the unmistakable shape of banded currency. He placed it on the metal table, just out of her reach. Jessica's eyes locked onto the envelope. A hungry, desperate light flared in her hollow gaze. She lurched forward, her hand extending to grab the lifeline. Lucas's hand moved with a blinding, terrifying velocity. He didn't strike her. He simply slammed his palm down flat onto the center of the envelope, pinning it to the metal table with a sharp, explosive crack that made Jessica shriek and recoil into her chair. "The transaction is incomplete," Lucas stated, the ambient temperature of the holding room seeming to drop 10 degrees. "I did everything," Jessica screamed, her voice cracking, the withdrawal symptoms surging violently in response to the adrenaline. "I broke him. What else do you want from me?" Lucas slowly removed his hand from the envelope. He picked it up and held it between his index and middle finger, tapping the thick edge against the metal table. Tap, tap, tap. The exact rhythm he had used with the wire transfer documents in the study. "Arthur is neutralized," Lucas said, his dark eyes fixed on her trembling face. "The proxy shares are compromised. The empire is entirely destabilized. But a transition of power requires a clean slate. It requires the absolute elimination of all outstanding liabilities." He stopped tapping the envelope. He looked directly at the two-way mirror. "Madeline," Lucas commanded, his voice vibrating through the audio feed, a dark sovereign authority echoing in the small room. "Unlock the door. Enter the vault." My hands remained frozen against the glass. The panic was a physical entity, clawing at the inside of my ribcage. I was the architect. I was the puppet master. I did not take orders from the asset. "Unlock the door, Mother," Lucas repeated, the word weaponized, dripping with a lethal, mocking deference. "Or the audio file transmits to the district attorney's secure server in precisely 60 seconds. The threat was absolute. He wasn't bluffing. He possessed the digital infrastructure to execute the transmission instantaneously. If I remained in the dark, the empire burned, and I would spend the rest of my life in a federal penitentiary. I pulled my hands away from the cold glass. My fingers were stiff, the joints aching from the sheer force of my grip. I forced my spine to straighten, ruthlessly shoving the panic into a locked compartment in the back of my mind. The architecture had collapsed, but the foundation remained. I had to step into the rubble and establish dominance over the monster I had built. I turned away from the mirror, my heels clicking sharply against the concrete floor of the observation corridor. I approached the heavy steel door. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The pneumatic seal hissed. The heavy locking mechanism disengaged with a loud, metallic clank. I pushed the door open. The harsh fluorescent light of the holding room spilled into the corridor, blinding me for a fraction of a second. I stepped over the threshold, the synthetic air wrapping around me. Jessica screamed the moment she saw me. She scrambled backward in the steel chair, dragging it across the epoxy floor, pressing herself into the far corner of the room like a terrified animal. "No!" she shrieked, clutching the gray blanket against her face. "You said she wasn't coming in. You said it was just us." Lucas did not look at her. He remained seated at the table, perfectly relaxed, watching my approach. I walked to the empty space at the head of the metal table, stopping equidistant between the shivering biological mother and the flawless, sociopathic son. I did not look at the envelope. I did not look at the digital recorder flashing its red pulse. I looked directly into Lucas's eyes. "You have executed a highly sophisticated maneuver, Lucas," I stated, my voice a dead flat frequency, betraying none of the internal hemorrhage. "You identified the vulnerability, you manipulated the environment, and you secured the leverage. I acknowledge the structural brilliance of the trap." "Validation from the architect," Lucas murmured, a faint, chilling smile curving his lips. "An unexpected, but appreciated, variable. However," I continued, leaning my weight slightly onto my left leg, establishing physical dominance over the space, "leverage is only functional If you possess the infrastructure to utilize it, you are a minor. The board of directors will not recognize your authority, regardless of the audio file. If you destroy me, you destroy the only viable proxy available to you. You burn the empire to rule over the ashes. I have no intention of destroying you, Madeline. Lucas replied smoothly, lacing his fingers together on the table. You possess decades of institutional knowledge, board leverage, and the ruthless operational capacity I require to maintain the stock price during the transition. You are a highly valuable asset. He tilted his head, his dark eyes stripping away my defenses, rendering me entirely transparent. I merely require you to acknowledge the new hierarchy, Lucas stated softly. You are no longer the architect. You are the general contractor. You will secure Arthur's proxy shares tomorrow morning. You will execute the medical transport to Switzerland. You will manage the board, but you will do it under my explicit direction. The audio file remains in my possession as a permanent insurance policy against your ambition. The absolute freezing reality of his design locked around my throat. He wasn't taking the throne. He was placing me on the throne with a collar around my neck, holding the leash in the dark. I was to be his pristine, untouchable proxy, executing his will while taking all the legal exposure. And if I refuse the terms? I asked, testing the absolute limit of his ruthlessness. Lucas didn't blink. He reached out and tapped the digital recorder. Then the recording transmits. Arthur is granted immunity. The empire falls. And you spend the next 2 decades in a federal cage. Lucas outlined the alternative with terrifying calm. The geometry of your position is absolute, Mother. There is only one viable exit. I stared at the flawless, marble features of the boy I had raised, the boy I had taught to capture the bishop without hesitation, the boy I had explicitly instructed to strangle the melody out of the cello until the audience suffocated. I had created a god in my own image, and the god had just demanded a sacrifice. What are your immediate directives? I asked, the words tasting like ash, signaling the formal surrender of my absolute sovereignty. Lucas's smile widened, a cold, brilliant flash of pure sociopathic victory. He had broken the master. The transition requires a clean slate, Lucas said, his voice dropping into a low, lethal register. He slowly turned his head, shifting his gaze from my face to the far corner of the room. Jessica was curled into a tight ball on the floor, weeping hysterically into the coarse fabric of the gray blanket, entirely shattered by the realization that her son was the devil holding the pitchfork. The biological liability has served her purpose, Lucas stated, his eyes fixed on the trembling woman. He picked up the thick white envelope of cash from the table and held it out toward me. The men in Queens are actively searching for her, Lucas murmured, the architecture of his final test materializing in the sterile air. A sudden influx of untraceable capital in a high-risk narcotics environment invariably attracts predatory attention. A fatal overdose or a violent altercation over the funds is a statistical certainty. He looked back at me, his dark eyes completely devoid of humanity. You taught me how to excise vulnerabilities, Madeline, Lucas whispered, offering me the envelope. Execute the extraction. The carriage clock in my mind stopped ticking. The ultimate trap wasn't the audio file. The ultimate trap was the envelope. He was forcing me to hand the biological mother the exact mechanism of her own destruction, sealing our partnership in blood, entirely under his command. I looked at the envelope. I looked at the boy. I looked at the woman shivering on the floor. I slowly reached out, my perfectly manicured fingers closing around the thick stack of cash. The heavy, bleached white envelope rested across the pads of my fingers. The thick, unyielding mass of the banded currency pressed against the seams of the paper, a dense block of compressed capital. It weighed exactly 1.2 pounds. It felt infinitely heavier. The fluorescent lighting of the subterranean vault washed over the surface of the envelope, highlighting the microscopic fibers of the paper. I traced the sharp, manufactured edge of the flap with the tip of my manicured thumbnail. The friction produced a faint, dry rasp that cut through the low, industrial drone of the ventilation system. I turned my wrist, slowly rotating the envelope in the sterile light. Across the metal table, the red LED of the digital recorder pulsed, a synthetic, rhythmic heartbeat marking the exact tempo of my supposed surrender. Lucas remained seated, his shoulders relaxed against the rigid back of the steel chair. The dark cashmere of his turtleneck absorbed the light, turning his torso into a void against the stark white walls. He did not blink. His chin was tilted up a fraction of a degree, the posture of a monarch observing a newly conquered territory. He was waiting for my compliance. He was waiting for the architect to lay the final brick in the prison he had designed for her. I lowered the envelope. My stilettos pivoted on the polished epoxy floor. The sharp, singular clack of the heel echoed in the concrete box. I began the walk toward the corner of the room. The distance was exactly 12 feet. I measured it in the slow, deliberate extension of my stride. I did not rush. I allowed the heavy silence to stretch, forcing the ambient pressure of the room to compress around the shivering woman curled against the baseboards. Jessica's knees were pulled tight against her chest, the coarse gray utility blanket pulled up over her mouth. Her blonde hair, matted into dull, jagged spikes, obscured her peripheral vision. As my shadow fell over her, she flinched violently, her spine grinding against the concrete wall. She squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to look at the instrument of her execution. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow spasms, pulling the rough fabric of the blanket taut across her protruding collarbones. The smell of her, a toxic, evaporating cloud of oxidized copper, stale perspiration, and the sweet, sickly decay of chronic narcotic withdrawal thickened the air in the corner, requiring a conscious effort to keep my breathing shallow. I stopped precisely 2 feet from the tips of her ruined, mud-caked shoes. I stood above her, a vertical column of black Dior silk and absolute stillness. I did not lean down. I did not offer the envelope immediately. I simply existed in her immediate airspace, allowing the sheer gravitational density of my presence to force her eyes open. Her eyelids fluttered, the lashes clumped with smeared, waterproof mascara. She looked at the hem of my dress, then slowly, agonizingly, tracked her gaze upward, past the pristine line of my posture, until she met my eyes. The capillaries in her sclera were ruptured, mapping a frantic red web across the whites of her eyes. The pupils were blown wide, black hollows entirely consumed by the physiological terror of a delayed fix. "Take it," I commanded. The words did not carry volume. They carried absolute, chilling density. Jessica's gaze dropped to the thick white envelope in my hand. A wet, ragged gasp tore through her throat. The animal instinct for survival, the desperate, localized hunger of the addiction, violently overrode the overarching terror of the room. Her right hand slipped out from beneath the gray blanket. The fingers were skeletal, the knuckles raw and cracked, the nails bitten down to the quick. Her hand hovered in the freezing synthetic air, shaking with a violent, high-frequency tremor. She reached for the paper, her fingertips brushing against the smooth surface. I did not release my grip. Jessica pulled, her frantic strength meeting the locked, immovable resistance of my fingers. She looked up at me, a silent, pathetic question forming in the bruised hollows of her face. "The capital provides mobility, Jessica," I stated, my voice dropping into a low, resonant register intended only for her ears, though the acoustics of the concrete vault carried every syllable to the pulsing red light on the table. "It secures the extraction from this perimeter. But capital does not alter the fundamental architecture of the organism holding it. You will carry this envelope up to the street. You will inhale the damp, freezing air of the financial district. And you will immediately begin the rapid, inevitable descent back into the exact conditions that brought you to this floor." A fresh tear spilled over her lower eyelid, cutting a clean, jagged path through the grime on her cheek. "I won't," she choked out, her voice a fragile, splintering reed. "I'll go to the Port Authority. I'll buy a ticket. I'll go back to Ohio. I swear to God, Madeline, I'll disappear." "You evaporated 16 years ago," I corrected smoothly. "You are merely a lingering condensation, and condensation invariably finds the lowest point of elevation." I slowly uncurled my fingers. The envelope slipped from my hand, the weight of it dropping heavily into her trembling palm. She instantly pulled it against her chest, wrapping both arms around the paper as if it were a living, breathing infant. She scrambled to her feet, the utility blanket falling away from her shoulders, pooling on the epoxy floor. Her knees buckled slightly, the physical atrophy of the withdrawal fighting against the sudden blinding surge of adrenaline. She did not look at Lucas. She did not look at the mirror. She turned her back on the absolute ruin of her biological legacy and staggered toward the heavy steel door. I remained perfectly still in the corner, tracking her movement through the periphery of my vision. She reached the door, her frantic, bloody fingers clawing at the heavy metal lever. The pneumatic seal hissed, protesting the sudden breach. She threw her entire emaciated weight against the steel, forcing the door open just wide enough to slip her narrow frame through the gap. The door swung shut behind her, the heavy latch engaged with a loud, percussive clank. The anomaly was excised. The laboratory was resealed. The silence in the holding room roared. The only remaining kinetic energy was the pulsing red LED light on the center of the metal table. Pulse, pulse, pulse. Lucas picked up the digital recorder. He held it between his palms, smoothing his thumbs over the matte black casing. The tension in his jaw had entirely vanished. The musculature of his face was relaxed, smoothed into a mask of pure, unadulterated serenity. He looked like a maestro who had just laid down his baton after executing a flawless symphony. "The extraction is complete," Lucas observed, his voice echoing in the sterilized air. "The biological liability is en route to self-termination. Arthur is neutralized. The proxy shares are secured. The transition of power is entirely streamlined." He looked up from the recorder, fixing his dark, empty eyes on my face. "You executed the directive flawlessly, Mother," he murmured, the title dripping with a slow, toxic condescension. "The recalibration of the hierarchy is officially documented. The architect assumes the role of the operator." I did not turn around immediately. I looked at the gray utility blanket abandoned on the floor. I noted the precise pattern of the folds, the way the coarse fabric absorbed the harsh overhead light. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the freezing synthetic oxygen deep into my diaphragm. The blood in my veins, which had been frozen solid by the revelation of his surveillance, began to slowly, rhythmically thaw. It did not boil. It simply returned to its optimal operating temperature. I turned on my heel. I walked away from the corner. I did not stop at the head of the table. I continued pacing along the perimeter of the room, my stilettos mapping a slow, deliberate circle around the steel chair where he sat. "The digital recording device," I began, my voice a quiet, conversational hum, devoid of the sharp, commanding edges I usually employed. "A highly effective mechanism for leverage. It captures the raw, unfiltered data of a structural collapse. It preserves the exact phrasing, the specific cadence of a confession. It is an undeniable, empirical anchor in a sea of corporate deniability." Lucas tracked my movement, his head swiveling slightly on his neck, keeping me in his direct line of sight. The serene mask remained firmly in place, but a microscopic tightening occurred around the corners of his eyes. He recognized the shift in my acoustic signature. I was no longer speaking from a position of forced submission. "I possess the audio file, Madeline," Lucas reminded me, tapping the casing of the recorder against the metal table. "Philosophical observations regarding the nature of the device do not alter the physical reality of the leverage. You possess a sequence of binary code," I corrected softly, continuing my slow orbit. "You possess a digital representation of a conversation that occurred in a specific room at a specific time. You observed the collapse of Arthur's infrastructure, and you recorded my methodology for exploiting it." I stopped directly behind his chair. The scent of his expensive cologne, a sophisticated blend of cedar and bergamot, rose from the collar of his cashmere sweater. It was the scent I had personally selected for him when he turned 15. A scent designed to project authority and mask the scent of youth. "You believed that observing the architecture was equivalent to understanding the foundation," I murmured, leaning slightly forward, projecting my voice directly over his left shoulder. Lucas's spine locked. The absolute, vertical rigidity returned instantly. The fingers of his right hand tightened around the digital recorder, the knuckles turning pale. "The foundation is compromised," Lucas stated, his voice losing a fraction of its smooth resonance, acquiring a harder, defensive edge. "The confession invalidates your authority. If you attempt to circumvent the parameters of our agreement, the file transmits." "Transmits where, Lucas?" I asked, resuming my slow pacing, moving into his peripheral vision on the right side. "To the district attorney's secure server? To the federal prosecutors currently auditing the shell companies?" I walked to the edge of the metal table and sat down, crossing my legs at the knee. I rested my hands lightly on the edge of the steel surface. I looked directly into his eyes. "You executed a brute force algorithm to bypass the two-factor authentication on Apex Holdings 90 days ago." I recited his own timeline back to him. "You severed the routing numbers. You starved the biological variable. You watched the pressure build until it cracked the facade of the St. Jude's recital. I tilted my head, perfectly mirroring the predatory angle he had used earlier. Did you truly believe, Lucas, that a multi-billion-dollar real estate conglomerate, currently under active federal investigation, relied on a cybersecurity firewall that a 16-year-old boy could breach from a laptop in his bedroom? The pulsing red light on the table seemed to stutter. Lucas's eyelids contracted, a rapid, involuntary blink. The serene mask fractured, a hairline crack spreading across the marble surface. The jaw muscle beneath his ear began to flutter, a rapid, rhythmic spasm. The encryption protocols were archaic, Lucas countered, his voice dropping into a tighter, accelerated cadence. The shell company was established 16 years ago. Arthur neglected to update the security infrastructure. The vulnerability was inherent to the code. Arthur does not manage the digital infrastructure of Vance Holdings, nor its subsidiary shell corporations. I corrected gently, the tone one might use to explain a fundamental mathematical error to a struggling student. The digital infrastructure is managed by a private cybersecurity firm based in Zurich, a firm that operates entirely under the directive of the primary shareholder's blind trust. I uncrossed my legs, planting both feet firmly on the epoxy floor. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance between us across the metal table. I control the blind trust, Lucas, I whispered. The air in the holding room rushed out of the ventilation vents, leaving behind a suffocating, pressurized silence. Lucas stared at me. The dark, empty voids of his eyes dilated, absorbing the catastrophic implication of my words. The fingers gripping the digital recorder slackened slightly. The vulnerability was not inherent to the code, I continued, the cold, brilliant fire returning to my own blood, illuminating the absolute darkness of my design. The vulnerability was engineered. I instructed the Zurich firm to downgrade the encryption protocols on Apex Holdings precisely 95 days ago. I authorized the creation of a digital backdoor. I left the door unlocked, Lucas. I left it unlocked, and I waited for you to walk through it. You, Lucas choked, the syllable scraping against his vocal cords. He swallowed hard, the sharp line of his Adam's apple bobbing violently against the collar of the cashmere turtleneck. You knew I was monitoring the ledger. I knew you were monitoring the ledger since the day you accessed the blood type discrepancy in your medical file, I confirmed, dismantling the entire architecture of his rebellion with methodical precision. I knew you observed the burner phone. I knew you traced the wire transfers. I watched you compile the data, waiting for you to weaponize it, but you were taking too long, Lucas. You were hoarding the capital without investing it. So, I provided the opportunity. I opened the door to Apex Holdings. I allowed you to sever the lifeline. I allowed you to summon Jessica to the recital. Lucas pushed his chair back, the metal legs shrieking against the epoxy floor. He stood up, his towering frame suddenly lacking the gravitational density it possessed 10 minutes ago. He looked like a hollow structure, a building whose core columns had just been detonated. You orchestrated the breach, Lucas breathed, his mind frantically running the calculations, desperately searching for the flaw in my logic. He looked down at the digital recorder in his hand. He gripped it tighter, raising it like a physical shield. It doesn't matter. The methodology of the breach is irrelevant. The audio file still exists. The confession of the hostile takeover is still captured on this device. If I transmit this, transmit it, I commanded. The words were absolute zero. They offered no quarter. They contained no bluff. Lucas froze. His thumb hovered over the transmission sequence button on the side of the device. The red light pulsed against his skin. Press the button, Lucas, I instructed, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. Execute the transmission to the federal servers. Send the audio file of my confession to the district attorney. The muscle in his jaw fluttered wildly. A bead of cold sweat broke out along his hairline, catching the harsh fluorescent light. He stared at the device, then back at my face, searching for the micro-expression of fear, the subtle tell of a desperate gamble. He found nothing. He found a titanium vault, entirely immune to the explosive charge he was holding. Why? Lucas whispered, the arrogance entirely stripped from his vocal cords, replaced by the raw, unadulterated terror of a prey animal realizing the trap was not a cage, but a slaughterhouse. If I transmit this, you are incarcerated. The empire falls. I slowly stood up from the metal table. I smoothed the invisible wrinkles from the skirt of my Dior dress. I walked around the edge of the table, stopping directly in front of him. I reached out, my fingers wrapping gently over his trembling hand, covering the digital recorder. "If you transmit that file to the federal authorities," I murmured, looking up into his wide, panicked eyes, "they will indeed receive a pristine, high-definition audio recording of a woman detailing the hostile takeover of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They will hear the precise methodology of the medical kidnapping of Arthur Hayes. They will hear the explicit acknowledgement of extortion." I squeezed his hand, the metal casing of the recorder pressing painfully into his palm. "But they will not hear my voice, Lucas," I revealed softly. Lucas stopped breathing. His chest froze mid-inhalation. The acoustic paneling in the headmaster's study at St. Jude's was installed 3 years ago, I explained, the architecture of my ultimate deception unfurling in the sterile air. It is a highly specialized, military-grade soundproofing foam designed to completely neutralize low-frequency resonance. It creates an acoustic dead zone, a standard, commercially available digital recording device concealed inside the breast pocket of a heavy wool uniform jacket is structurally incapable of penetrating that dead zone to capture a whispered conversation occurring 12 feet away. Lucas's eyes darted down to the device in his hand, then back to my face. The absolute, crushing reality of the physical limitations of his hardware crashed into his consciousness. The audio file on that device is not a recording of the headmaster's study, I stated, releasing his hand, taking a single step back to observe the total collapse of his infrastructure. "Then what is it?" Lucas gasped, his voice fracturing into a desperate, hollow rasp. "Play it," I commanded. Lucas's thumb scrambled over the side of the device. His fine motor control, the flawless precision of the cellist, had entirely disintegrated. He fumbled with the buttons, his breath coming in short, erratic bursts. He finally depressed the playback switch. A sharp burst of static hissed from the small internal speaker, followed immediately by the ambient, metallic hum of a subterranean ventilation system. The acoustics were entirely different from a wood-paneled study. They were harsh, echoing, bouncing off solid concrete walls. A voice began to speak. It was not a whispered, commanding female tone. It was a low, smooth baritone. The biological liability has served her purpose. The sound of Lucas's own voice echoed in the holding room, overlapping perfectly with the digital playback. A sudden influx of untraceable capital in a high-risk narcotics environment invariably attracts predatory attention. A fatal overdose or a violent altercation over the funds is a statistical certainty. Lucas stared at the device in absolute, uncomprehending horror. He pressed the stop button, cutting off the audio feed. "How?" Lucas choked, stumbling backward until his spine hit the concrete wall. He looked at the device as if it had mutated into a venomous serpent. "The device was in my pocket. I activated it in the study." "You activated a device that captured nothing but the friction of your own shirt collar against the microphone mesh," I corrected, walking slowly toward him, cornering him against the wall. "But when you entered this holding room, you placed the device openly on the metal table. You believed you were operating in a secure, isolated environment. You believed you controlled the acoustics." I reached out and tapped the flashing red light on the device he still clutched against his chest. "I control the environment, Lucas," I whispered. "The holding room is equipped with a highly sophisticated, continuously looping audio interceptor, a proprietary system installed directly into the ventilation grating above our heads. It captured every syllable of your interaction with Jessica. It captured your explicit admission of starving her by hacking the Apex Holdings account. And it captured your explicit directive to execute her by providing the capital." I tilted my head, watching the color drain entirely from his face, leaving behind a pale, bloodless mask of pure terror. "The device in your hand is currently slaved to the room's primary network via a localized Bluetooth override." I revealed the final devastating layer of the code. It is not recording. It is acting as a remote speaker, playing back the audio file currently residing on my secure servers. Lucas looked up at the ceiling, his eyes scanning the sterile white tiles, frantically searching for the hidden microphones, realizing the cage he thought he had locked me in was actually the execution chamber I had built for him. "You didn't orchestrate a hostile takeover tonight, Lucas," I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute terrifying finality. "You orchestrated a felony extortion, a cyber intrusion into a corporate account, and conspiracy to commit murder. And you documented it perfectly on my servers. The digital recorder slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the epoxy floor with a sharp crack, the plastic casing splintering, the red LED light flickering and dying. Lucas collapsed against the concrete wall, sliding down until his knees hit the floor. The flawless vertical column, the arrogant monarch, the apex predator, all of it shattered into a million jagged pieces, leaving behind a terrified, hyperventilating 16-year-old boy. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving with violent, silent sobs. I stood over him. I did not feel a single flicker of maternal instinct. I did not feel pity. I felt the profound, cold satisfaction of a sculptor observing the final, perfect cut of the chisel into the marble. "Why?" Lucas sobbed, the sound muffled by his hands. "If you knew I was planning the coup, why did you let me execute it? Why did you hand her the envelope? Why did you let me order her death?" I crouched down, the silk of my dress pooling on the polished epoxy. I reached out, my fingers grasping his chin, forcing his head up. I looked directly into his tear-streaked, devastated eyes. "Because the Hayes Primary Trust contains a morality clause, Lucas," I explained, "the architecture of my ultimate design, finally fully illuminated. If the designated heir is proven, via irrefutable digital evidence, to have engaged in felony extortion or conspiracy to commit murder, the 30% voting shares do not transfer upon his 21st birthday. The shares immediately default to the primary executor of the estate." Lucas stared at me, the breath shuddering in his lungs, as the absolute zero of my strategy froze the blood in his veins. "You are the primary executor," Lucas whispered. "I am the sole executor," I corrected softly. "Arthur's shares will transfer to my control tomorrow morning when he signs the proxy out of sheer terror of the federal audit. But your shares, the shares you believed guaranteed your throne, required a verifiable criminal act to void the trust. You were too careful, Lucas. You operated in the shadows. I needed you to step into the light. I needed you to commit the crime on record. I needed you to attempt to destroy your own mother." I released his chin. I stood up, smoothing my dress. "The envelope you ordered me to give her," I added, looking down at his broken form. "The banded currency. The serial numbers were registered with the federal authorities 3 days ago in connection to the Apex Holdings investigation. The moment she attempts to exchange those bills for narcotics, she will be apprehended by a federal task force. She will not overdose. She will be incarcerated in a federal facility for possession of stolen capital and extortion. She will spend the rest of her natural life in a cage, and the evidence she provides will point directly to the IP address of the laptop in your bedroom." Lucas let out a ragged, agonizing wail, a sound of total soul-crushing despair. He curled into a tight fetal position on the floor, pressing his forehead against the cold concrete. He had tried to outmaneuver the architect, and he had engineered his own absolute destruction. "You are a monster," Lucas choked out, repeating the exact words his biological mother had used 20 minutes earlier. "I am the environment, Lucas," I replied, my voice echoing off the walls of the holding room. "A sovereign authority asserting absolute dominion over the space. And you are merely a product of your environment." I turned away from the boy weeping on the floor. I walked toward the heavy steel door. I did not look back. I reached the door, pressing my thumb against the biometric scanner. The pneumatic seal hissed, welcoming the master back into the corridors of power. I stepped over the threshold, into the freezing synthetic air of the observation corridor. I stopped. I turned to the two-way mirror. I reached into the small beaded clutch resting against my hip. I pulled out a sleek silver remote control. I held it up, aiming it at the glass separating the observation corridor from the holding room. I pressed the single black button. The polarization of the thick glass instantly reversed. The observation corridor, previously plunged in absolute darkness, was suddenly flooded with a brilliant, blinding wash of harsh white light. The darkness dissolved entirely. I was not standing in an isolated, empty hallway. I was standing at the part of a subterranean, tiered amphitheater. Behind me, seated in rows of plush, leather ergonomic chairs, were 12 individuals. The senior partners of the Hayes Foundation Legal Defense Team, the chief compliance officer of the conglomerate, the managing director of the Zurich cybersecurity firm, and the Honorable Judge Richard Sterling, the primary overseer of the Hayes Family Trust. They sat in absolute, paralyzed silence. Their faces were washed in the pale light, reflecting off the glass. Their eyes were wide, horrified, fixated on the holding room on the other side of the now transparent mirror. They had not merely listened to an audio feed. They had been seated in this amphitheater for the last 45 minutes. They had watched the entire interaction through the glass. They had watched the boy, the supposed heir to the empire, coldly negotiate the execution of a vagrant. They had watched him admit to hacking the corporate shell accounts. They had watched him attempt to extort the primary executor of the estate. They had witnessed the monster in its natural habitat, completely unfiltered, entirely unmasked. Lucas, curled on the floor of the holding room, slowly raised his head. He looked at the glass. He saw the polarization shift. He saw the 12 figures sitting in the amphitheater. He saw the judge holding the physical copy of the morality clause. The boy's mouth opened in a silent, unending scream as the full, catastrophic reality of his annihilation crashed down upon him. He hadn't just confessed to a recording device. He had confessed to the jury, the executioner, and the architects of his trust fund, all broadcasting live from the other side of the mirror. I turned my back on the glass, severing eye contact with the broken asset on the floor. I faced the 12 members of the board. I smoothed the lapel of my Dior dress. My pulse was a steady, rhythmic metronome, perfectly calibrated to the tempo of absolute victory. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting effortlessly across the tiered seating, carrying the smooth, chilling resonance of a maestro signaling the final movement of the symphony. "I believe the parameters of the morality clause have been demonstrably breached. The immediate transfer of the voting proxy is required to secure the stability of the firm. The acoustic dampening installed in the 85th floor executive suite of the Hayes Holdings Tower did not merely filter the ambient noise of Manhattan, it eradicated it. The chaotic, grinding friction of 8 million lives occurring hundreds of feet below was reduced to absolute, sterile silence. The floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass panels offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the financial district, yet they permitted no thermal transfer. The air inside the office was maintained at a precise, unwavering 68 degrees. It smelled of ozone, polished mahogany, and the faint, lingering chemical residue of the commercial cleaning crew that had spent the previous night entirely erasing Arthur's physical footprint from the space. I stood by the window, the toes of my Jimmy Choo pumps positioned exactly 2 inches from the glass barrier, the storm that had battered the city during the street. Jude's recital 3 days ago had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a sky the color of bruised iron. The jagged spires of the surrounding skyscrapers pierced the low-hanging cloud cover, their aviation warning lights pulsing in a slow, synchronized rhythm. Pulse, pulse, pulse. I watched the red lights bleed through the gray mist. The rhythm did not accelerate my heart rate. My pulse remained a steady, mechanical 60 beats per minute. Behind me, the heavy oak door of the executive suite unlatched. The mechanical click of the heavy brass tumblers aligning was the loudest sound in the room. I did not turn around. I tracked the subtle shift in barometric pressure as the door opened, pulling a draft of the hallway's warmer, circulated air into my perimeter. The footsteps approaching across the imported wool carpet were hesitant, dragging slightly on the upswing. "The final filings are prepared for your authorization, Madeline." The voice belonged to Thomas Vance, the senior managing partner of the firm's legal division. 3 days ago, Thomas had addressed me as Mrs. Hayes, his tone laced with the polite, dismissive condescension reserved for a board member's wife whose primary function was hosting charity galas. Today, the honorific was conspicuously absent, replaced by a careful, trembling deference. I rotated slowly, the silk of my blouse whispering against my skin. Thomas stood 3 feet from the edge of the massive mahogany desk. He held a thick, leather-bound portfolio. His charcoal suit, usually tailored to project aggressive competence, seemed to hang loosely from his shoulders. The knot of his tie was perfectly symmetrical, but the collar beneath it was damp. He avoided direct eye contact, his gaze fixed rigidly on the silver fountain pen resting precisely parallel to the leather blotter on the desk. "The transition timeline," I prompted, my voice a flat, dead frequency that barely disturbed the air in the room. Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. He opened the portfolio, his fingers struggling briefly with the brass clasp. The medical proxy for Arthur was ratified by the Swiss authorities at 0400 hours EST, Thomas recited, reading the dense legal text without absorbing its meaning. He was admitted to the secure psychiatric wing of the Clinique La Prairie, under the highest tier of confidentiality protocols. The attending physician's preliminary report confirms severe stress-induced dissociative psychosis. The heavy sedation regimen has been initiated. He is entirely unresponsive to external stimuli. The duration of the hold, I instructed, moving slowly toward the high-backed leather chair behind the desk. Indefinite, Thomas confirmed, turning a page, the heavy parchment scraping loudly. The board unanimously approved the medical leave of absence. The transfer of the 70% voting proxy to your direct control is absolute and irrevocable until a panel of 3 independent psychiatrists, all selected by the trust's executor, deem him legally competent. A statistical impossibility given the current medical directives. I sat down. The leather chair, previously molded to the exact specifications of Arthur's spine, felt vast and hollow. I rested my forearms on the edge of the mahogany surface, interlacing my fingers. "And the biological liability?" I said. Thomas flinched. A microscopic contraction of the muscles around his left eye. He closed the portfolio, placing it squarely in the center of the desk. Jessica Miller was apprehended by federal agents at 0200 hours yesterday at a designated narcotics distribution hub in Queens, Thomas reported, his voice dropping an octave, desperate to distance himself from the reality of the words. The serial numbers on the banded currency matched the sequence logged in the Apex Holdings embezzlement audit. She was in possession of a significant quantity of illicit substances at the time of the arrest. The federal prosecutor has denied bail. She is currently occupying a maximum security holding cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. Her legal representation: a court-appointed public defender carrying a caseload of 200 active felonies, Thomas replied, the ghost of a terrified, sycophantic smile touching his lips before vanishing. The public defender has already advised her to accept a plea deal for a mandatory minimum of 20 years to avoid the maximum penalty for the federal extortion charges. She possesses no resources to mount a defense. She has essentially ceased to exist as a legal entity. The architecture of the destruction was flawless. The foundation had been poured, the steel beams erected, and the concrete allowed to cure in the dark. I reached out and picked up the silver fountain pen. The metal was heavy, cold against the pads of my fingers. I unscrewed the cap, the microscopic threading sliding silently apart. I pulled the portfolio toward me, flipping to the final page marked with a yellow adhesive flag. "The morality clause," I stated, the nib of the pen hovering a millimeter above the signature line. Thomas took a small, involuntary step backward, retreating from the desk. The air in his lungs seemed to evaporate entirely. The judge executed the immediate default of the 30% trust allocation at 0900 hours, Thomas whispered, staring at the pen in my hand as if it were a loaded firearm. The digital evidence presented during the closed-door amphitheater session was deemed irrefutable. The minor, Lucas Hayes, has been officially stripped of all financial, custodial, and legal ties to the Hayes empire. The shares have reverted entirely to the primary executor. I pressed the nib to the paper. The ink flowed in a smooth, continuous line, dark and permanent, legally binding the absolute consolidation of my power. I signed my name with a slow, meticulous precision, tracing the elegant loops and sharp angles of the letters. "The boy's current location?" I asked, finishing the signature and carefully screwing the cap back onto the pen. "The Blackwood Institute, upstate New York," Thomas answered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "A highly specialized, secure behavioral modification facility designed for violent or severely compromised adolescents of high net worth individuals. The facility operates completely off the grid. The conservatorship documents granting you absolute medical and physical control over his placement are sealed by the state Supreme Court." I closed the portfolio. The dull thud resonated through the mahogany desk. "You will manage the press release regarding Arthur's health," I instructed. The transaction concluded. "Focus on the tragedy of executive burnout. Emphasize the firm's commitment to stability under my direct leadership." "You are dismissed, Thomas." The senior partner did not offer a closing pleasantry. He simply nodded, turned on his heel, and walked rapidly toward the oak door, his posture practically collapsing the moment he believed he was out of my direct line of sight. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing the vault once more. I was alone. I pushed the leather chair back and stood up. I walked slowly away from the desk, moving toward the far corner of the expansive office. Resting on a custom-built, velvet-lined display stand was a cello. It was a 19th-century Italian masterpiece, carved from aged spruce and maple, varnished in a deep, blood-red resin. I had purchased it at auction in London for $2.4 million when Lucas turned 14. I stopped in front of the instrument. The overhead recessed lighting caught the subtle curves of the wood. It was an object of breathtaking, terrifying beauty. A weapon designed to manipulate the acoustic environment, capable of dominating the breathing patterns of 500 people simultaneously. I reached out, my index finger brushing against the thick, coiled wire of the C-string. I applied a fraction of an ounce of pressure. The string depressed, but it did not vibrate. It did not produce a low, mournful note. Without the tension of the bow, without the application of calculated, relentless friction, the instrument was entirely silent. It was merely a hollow cavity of dead wood and cold wire, suspended in a sterile, soundproofed room. I pulled my hand away. I turned back to the mahogany desk. In the center of the leather blotter, directly beside the signed portfolio, sat a sleek, encrypted tablet. I walked over and touched the dark screen. The biometric scanner registered my fingerprint. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dim office with a harsh blue glow. The display was divided into two high-definition video feeds. The left feed was transmitted from a secure IP mask server in Geneva. It showed a pristine white hospital room overlooking the snow-capped peaks of the Alps. In a heavy mechanized medical recliner sat Arthur. He was wearing a soft gray cashmere cardigan. His head was tilted sharply to the left, resting against the padded headrest. A thin line of saliva traced a path from the corner of his slack mouth down to his collar. His eyes were open, but the pupils were dilated into massive black voids, completely unresponsive to the breathtaking mountain landscape outside the reinforced window. The chemical restraints flowing through his intravenous line had entirely eradicated the real estate titan, leaving behind a pliant, hollowed-out shell. I watched the slow, mechanical rise and fall of his chest for 30 seconds. I shifted my gaze to the right feed. The right feed was transmitted from a closed-circuit camera mounted in the corner of a 10 by 10-foot room at the Blackwood Institute, 300 miles north of Manhattan. The room was entirely devoid of sharp edges, loose furniture, or acoustic paneling. The walls were padded in a seamless, pale gray synthetic material. The only object in the space was a heavy, bolted mattress on the floor. Sitting in the exact center of the mattress, his legs crossed, his spine forming a flawless, vertical line, was Lucas. He wore the standard facility uniform, a featureless, soft cotton scrub suit in a dull charcoal gray. His dark hair had been shorn close to the scalp, stripping away the aristocratic aesthetic he had cultivated for the elite academies. He was not pacing. He was not exhibiting the frantic, neurological tremors of the woman he had sent to federal prison. He was entirely, terrifyingly still. He was looking directly up at the camera lens mounted in the ceiling. He knew the lens was a one-way mirror. He knew exactly who was sitting on the other side of the encrypted fiber optic cable. I stared into the dark, empty voids of his eyes on the high-definition screen. There was no rage in his expression. There was no despair over the loss of the 30% trust, the cello, or his freedom. There was only the cold, clinical assessment of an apex predator, analyzing the exact dimensions of its new cage, systematically cataloging the structural weaknesses of the pale gray padding. He was waiting. He had absorbed the ultimate lesson. He understood that a dormant asset only generates yield when applied at the precise point of maximum structural vulnerability. I had locked him in a vault, but I had not deleted the code. I had merely forced the software into hibernation. I reached out and pressed the power button on the tablet. The blue light vanished, plunging the mahogany desk back into the gray, muted shadows of the storm. The video feed severed, cutting the invisible tethers connecting me to the ruins of the family I had engineered. I turned away from the desk and walked back to the floor-to-ceiling glass. I looked down at the grid of Manhattan, the sprawling, chaotic engine of power and capital that now belonged entirely to me. I had excised the cowardice. I had imprisoned the anomaly. I had neutralized the threat of the prodigy. The architecture of my absolute sovereignty was flawless, impenetrable, and entirely complete. The air in the executive suite was freezing. I stood at the apex of the empire I had built, completely encased in the soundproofed, temperature-controlled silence of my own flawless design, recognizing with absolute, crushing clarity that the perfect fortress is indistinguishable from a tomb.